I've spent most of my life studying how nations rise and fall. The pattern never changes. Empires don't collapse because of a single war or decision. They decay slowly through thousands of rationalizations that seem harmless until they converge into disaster. What troubles me most is how familiar that pattern feels. Now, here within the United States, we still speak as though American power is eternal, as if history itself bends to our institutions, our markets, or democracy. I once believed that too. I believed the system could correct itself, that our political debates were proof of strength, not paralysis. But over the years, I've watched confidence harden into denial, and denial is the final stage before decline. I remember the numbers. In 1980, the United States accounted for a quarter of the world's economy. Today, it's less than 20%. On paper, that might seem insignificant, a few percentage points lost to globalization. But in practice, it's the measure of something deeper, a shift in the world's center of gravity. Every empire that loses its economic edge soon loses everything built upon it: influence, reach, even the illusion of control. Our political system was meant to channel ambition into progress. Instead, it's been captured not by ideology, but by money. I've sat in Washington meetings where policy was dictated by those who could fund campaigns, not those who could serve the public good. Corporations, defense contractors, and financial institutions write the first drafts of our laws. Every line of the budget tells the story: tax breaks for the powerful, rising debt for everyone else. We spend more on the military than the next 9 countries combined. While our bridges rust, our classrooms crumble, and our people lose faith, and that loss of faith may be the most dangerous deficit of all. When a majority of citizens believe their children will live worse lives than they did, the social contract breaks. Empires don't just run on armies and currencies, they run on belief. Once belief erodes, everything else follows. I've seen this before in Moscow before the Soviet collapse, in London before the end of the empire. The leaders still gave grand speeches. The citizens still waved flags. But beneath the ceremony, the foundation had already begun to crack. History teaches us that decline accelerates. Portugal fell in a year. The Soviet Union is in 2. France's empire vanished in 8. The British Empire unraveled in 1773. The timelines differ, but the rhythm is constant: a long prelude of denial, followed by a swift unraveling once reality asserts itself. We are still in the prelude, but the tempo is quickening. The American exceptionalism I grew up with was not arrogance, it was conviction, the belief that this nation could always reinvent itself, that faith sustained us through crises, wars, and depressions. But somewhere along the way, conviction turned into complacency. We began to assume that reinvention was automatic, that greatness was permanent. It never is. Every empire that believed itself immune to history shared the same delusion that the laws of decline applied to everyone else. As I look back over the data, the travels, the years of policy debates, I see the same truth emerging. We are exhausting ourselves trying to preserve the symbols of power instead of its substance. We expand our military while neglecting our society. We subsidize consumption while deferring the bills. We mistake dominance for leadership, spectacle for strength, and yet I do not believe the story is finished. Decline is not destiny. It's a choice disguised as inevitability. What will decide our future is not whether we can delay the fall, but whether we can face the truth before it's too late. The hardest thing for any great nation to do is to look in the mirror and recognize that the age of effortless supremacy has passed. That's where our story begins, not with collapse, but with awakening, the moment when an empire must decide whether to adapt or vanish. I've seen this crossroads before in the archives of history. Now I see it outside my own window. I have spent years warning that America's greatest vulnerability isn't foreign, it's internal. Power doesn't vanish because someone takes it away. It decays when a nation misuses it, when confidence turns into arrogance, and when the systems designed to preserve strength begin to hollow from within. That is what I see. Now the machinery of decline, grinding quietly beneath the noise of politics and spectacle. China and Russia are not trying to destroy the United States out of ideology. They are adapting to a world where the old rules no longer work. When Washington decided to weaponize the dollar, turning the global financial system into an instrument of punishment rather than partnership, it pushed other nations to build something new. I warned years ago that every sanction imposed in haste would accelerate a reckoning. That reckoning has begun. Today, oil trades in yuan. Russia and China conduct major energy transactions outside the dollar. The petrodollar system that sustained American dominance for half a century is eroding, not through revolution, but through quiet substitution. The BRICS Pay network now enables nations to settle trade without relying on the U.S. dollar. A new infrastructure, digital, decentralized, and deliberately insulated from Western leverage, is emerging. The privilege of printing the world's reserve currency, of buying goods with paper that others must earn, is slipping away. I recall when that privilege was referred to as a miracle of trust, but trust, once weaponized, transforms into fear. Countries are no longer asking how to join America's system. They are asking how to survive without it. That is how empires lose their grip, not by defeat on the battlefield, but by the steady withdrawal of consent from the rest of the world. And yet, the end of dominance is not the end of America. That distinction matters more than people realize. An empire can fade while a nation thrives if it learns to live within limits. Britain endured, Japan adapted. The question for America is whether we can do the same or whether pride will demand a confrontation we cannot win. What I call for is not surrender, but restraint, a recognition that global hegemony is no longer sustainable, and that our security lies not in dominance, but in renewal. We must redirect our resources from foreign bases to domestic schools, from endless wars to enduring infrastructure, from subsidizing weapons to cultivating wisdom, power that cannot improve. Life at home is power wasted abroad. History offers a cruel symmetry. Rome fell defending borders it could no longer afford to defend. The British Empire bankrupted itself, preserving illusions of grandeur. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of military expansion and economic decay. Each believed that retreat meant ruin. In truth, denial was the ruin. The same choice faces us now. We can continue to pretend that every crisis abroad is existential, that every challenge requires another deployment, another $1 trillion borrowed against the future, or we can accept that the world has changed and so must we. Multipolarity is not defeated. It is the natural correction to a century of imbalance. What will decide our fate is not what happens in Beijing or Moscow, but what happens here in our politics, our priorities, our capacity to tell ourselves the truth. Decline begins when nations confuse a movement for direction and noise for purpose. Renewal begins when they stop. I do not believe it is too late, but I do believe the window is closing. If we can recognize the machinery of decline while it still turns slowly, we can rebuild it. If we wait until it seizes completely, history will move on without us. Every empire eventually reaches the same realization that its greatest enemy is arithmetic. No ideology, no speech, no military parade can alter the mathematics of overextension. I have spent my life studying those numbers, and today the American balance sheet tells a story as ominous as any in history. The federal deficit now hovers near 7% of GDP, even during times of economic growth. That number should terrify us. In the past, such deficits only appeared during world wars or severe recessions. Running them during normal times signals something worse than crisis. It signals denial. It states that we have built a system that cannot function without borrowing from the future, one that consumes tomorrow to pay for yesterday. Our national debt has already surpassed the size of the entire economy. Within 2 decades, if current trend persists, it will double again, reaching 200% of GDP. I have testified before Congress about these projections, and I have watched the same ritual unfold every time. Nods of concern, promises of restraint, followed by another round of spending that everyone knows we cannot afford. Empires collapse not because they are unaware of their trajectory, but because they lack the discipline to change it. The implications of this debt go far beyond economics. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, the backbone of American influence, depends on confidence that the government will honor its obligations, confidence that the economy remains stable, confidence that the political system will act rationally when needed. Lose that confidence, and the entire structure begins to wobble. Interest rates rise, borrowing costs explode. Suddenly, the empire's ability to fund its global reach, the bases, the fleets, the guarantees vanishes almost overnight. We already see the warning signs. In 2024, the United States spent nearly $1 trillion on defense, more than the next 9 countries combined. Yet the military faces recruitment shortages, aging equipment, and logistical strain. The return on investment is diminishing. At the same time, the cost of servicing the national debt, just paying the interest, now exceeds spending on both Medicare and national defense. Imagine that we spend more to maintain the illusion of wealth than to protect the nation that supposedly holds it. This is the essence of fiscal decay, when the system exists to sustain itself rather than serve its purpose. Collapse is not a question of if, but when. I've seen it before in Latin America's debt crises, in the Soviet budget collapse, in the final years of the British Empire. Once creditors lose faith, once investors start asking for higher yields to hold your bonds, the walls close in fast. You cannot print credibility. The tragedy is that none of this is inevitable. America still possesses immense wealth, innovation, and talent, but those assets are trapped inside a political system that rewards short-term promises and punishes long-term honesty. Every election becomes an auction of unsustainable pledges. Every budget assumes growth that never comes, and every leader knows that telling the truth about austerity is political suicide. So the game continues until it can't. If a fiscal crisis arrives, it will not resemble the movies. There will be no dramatic default. No flags will be lowered in defeat. It will happen quietly through forced austerity, the collapse of programs, and a shrinking global footprint. The empire won't be conquered. It will simply run out of credit. And the world, once dependent on American debt as the safest asset on earth, will move on to something else. This is the ticking clock at the heart of the American system. Every second, the interest compounds. Every year, the promises grow. Every generation, the courage to confront it diminishes. I know how these stories end. I've studied them my entire life. They always begin with confidence and end with arithmetic. We are approaching that arithmetic now. The question that remains is whether we will face it by choice or by force. When I speak to policymakers in Washington, I often hear the same phrase: we must project strength. It's a mantra repeated so often that few ever pause to ask what it really means. But history has taught me that empires begin to die the moment they confuse the appearance of strength with its reality. America is now at that threshold. Our military budget approaches $1 trillion a year more than the combined budgets of the next 9 nations. We call it defense, but much of it sustains a sprawling global footprint conceived in another century. 800 bases in 70 countries, fleets, sea, cling, oceans, alliances that span continents. On paper, it appears to be powerful. In practice, it is debt political, economic, and moral. We maintain commitments that no longer serve strategy, only inertia. In theory, this vast network serves as a deterrent to adversaries. In reality, it tempts us into conflicts we cannot win. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya each began with confident rhetoric about freedom and security. Each ended the same way: trillions spent, thousands lost, and no clear victory to claim. I remember visiting Washington in those years. The tone was always the same: defiant optimism wrapped around quiet fatigue. The system had become self-perpetuating wars, justified budgets, justified wars. Even now, the same logic remains in effect. The instinct when facing decline is not to retrench, but to overextend, to prove that supremacy endures. This is precisely what happened to the Soviet Union in the 1,970 seconds, and to Rome long before it. Overextension is not a sign of strength. It is an admission of weakness disguised as ambition. Inside the Pentagon, I've met officers who know this. They understand that our forces are stretched, our readiness is uneven, and our strategy is unclear. They speak candidly off record, then retreat to the language of ceremony when cameras appear. It is the same dual reality that marks every empire's final act: an external narrative of control and an internal awareness of exhaustion. The illusion of strength extends beyond the military. Our foreign policy still assumes that the nations will automatically align with us, that our preferences define legitimacy. But in Asia, Africa, and even Europe, I hear a different tone. Countries now speak of strategic autonomy, of hedging, of balancing between powers. They no longer ask what America will permit. They ask what America can still enforce. That question, once unthinkable, is now common. The irony is that this illusion of dominance has become the greatest threat to real power. We spend our resources maintaining the symbols of leadership instead of the foundations that produce it: education, innovation, and trust. We try to hold the world together while our own society frays. We call for unity abroad while polarization at home paralyzes our politics. No empire survives that kind of dissonance for long. History offers a cruel mirror. The British believed their empire was still unassailable long after its industrial base crumbled. The Soviets believed their system was eternal, even as their economy stagnated. Both retained the theater of power until the curtain fell. America now performs its own version of that play: grand speeches, global summits, massive budgets, all choreographed to prove that decline is impossible. But denial is not a strategy. True strength is not measured in fleets or budgets. It is measured in resilience, in the capacity to adapt, to tell hard truths, to rebuild from within. That is what we are losing. We have become masters of projection, but amateurs of reflection. And as history has shown again and again, The former cannot save an empire once it forgets how to do the latter. I have seen what follows when illusions break. It happens suddenly. Confidence evaporates. Alliances shift. Markets panic. And what once felt permanent becomes fragile overnight. The collapse is never theatrical. It is administrative, bureaucratic, and procedural in nature. One day, the empire is unable to meet its obligations, and the world quietly adjusts to a new order. That moment has not yet come for America, but I can feel its gravity pulling closer. The numbers, the decisions, the tone of our politics all point to the same trajectory. And as with every empire before us, the danger lies not in what others do to us, but in what we refuse to admit to ourselves. The illusion of strength is comforting. It tells us that leadership endures without renewal, that debt doesn't matter, that history can be postponed indefinitely. But strength built on denial cannot last. I have seen this film too many times to mistake it for triumph. The credits always roll the same way: a nation still proud, still loud, and suddenly powerless. I've often said that America's decline will not come from an external enemy, but from paralysis within. Empires do not collapse because they lack information. They collapse because they cannot act on it. That is where we stand today, a nation still rich in ideas and intelligence, yet incapable of translating either into coherent policy. For years, I've sat in meetings with senators, advisors, and cabinet officials who understand perfectly well what must be done: reduce deficits, rebuild education, invest in research, and reform campaign finance. Everyone nods, everyone agrees, and then nothing happens. The machinery of government turns, but it no longer moves. Every decision becomes a negotiation with vested interests too powerful to offend, too essential to reform. Our politics has become theater, constant outrage, endless scandal, manufactured crises that generate attention but solve nothing. In a functioning democracy, débat produce direction. In ours, debate has become the destination itself. The goal is not to govern, but to perform. The media amplifies division because division sells. Politicians embrace it because polarization guarantees relevance. The result is stasis disguised as struggle. When I visit other countries, people often ask why the United States can't fix its obvious problems. The answer is brutally simple: money. The system is not broken, it's working exactly as designed. Campaigns cost billions, and those billions must be repaid. Lobbyists write legislation, corporations finance elections, and the public becomes a spectator to a government that speaks their language but serves someone else's interests. This capture is not abstract. It shapes every budget, every reform, every foreign intervention. Defense contractors ensure the war machine never pauses. Pharmaceutical giants ensure healthcare never becomes affordable. Wall Street ensures speculation remains more profitable than work, each sector extracts its share while the public pays the bill. It is an extraction disguised as governance. The consequence is a government that cannot prioritize. We fund everything and achieve nothing. We debate infrastructure while bridges collapse. We promise education reform while classrooms deteriorate. We call for unity while designing districts to ensure division. And when citizens finally lose faith, we label them cynical instead of admitting they are right. What makes this paralysis so dangerous is its self-reinforcing nature. As faith in institutions declines, so does participation in them. As participation falls, the influence of money grows. The more the system is captured, the less legitimate it becomes. The less legitimate it becomes, the harder it is to reform. This is how empires die democratically, not through coups or revolutions, but through exhaustion. History is merciless in this regard. The Roman Senate debated endlessly while the provinces burned. The late Ottomans reformed on paper while corruption devoured their treasury. The Soviet Politburo issued decrees that were largely ignored. In each case, the ruling class mistook rhetoric for action, words for change. America's own institutions now echo those same rituals, grand statements, bipartisan commission, blue ribbon panels, all designed to demonstrate motion without consequence. And yet, I still believe democracy contains the seed of renewal. The problem is not that our system is incapable of reform, but that we've forgotten how to use it. We have mistaken comfort for freedom, partisanship for participation, outrage for principle. If we could reclaim the courage to tell ourselves the truth, to confront the arithmetic, the corruption, the decay, our democracy could still be the instrument of recovery rather than the stage of collapse. But courage is in short supply. It requires leaders willing to lose elections for the sake of honesty, citizens willing to sacrifice convenience for integrity, and institutions willing to prioritize the long term over the next quarter. That is the hardest reform of all, moral, not procedural. So the paralysis continues. The clock ticks, budget passe, elections come and go. The language of power remains fluent, but the grammar of governance is gone. And I fear that when history finally writes this chapter, it will not say America fell because it was defeated, but because it refused to move while the ground shifted beneath its feet. For most of my life, American policymakers have spoken as if the world revolves around Washington. That illusion may have been plausible once, but it is gone now. The global center of gravity has shifted eastward, and no amount of rhetoric, spending, or strategy can reverse it. What we are witnessing is not a rebellion against the West, but a rebalancing of history itself. In 1500, Asia accounted for nearly 2/3 of global output. By 1950, after centuries of colonialism and war, that figure had collapsed to under 20%. Today, Asia once again produces roughly half of the world's economy. it is not a revolution, it is a return to normal. The industrial rise of China, the technological surge of India, the resource leverage of Russia and the Middle East all are part of a natural correction after 5 centuries of Western dominance. The United States still holds enormous power, but it no longer holds times exclusive, times power. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War was a historical anomaly, not a permanent state of affairs. I lived through that moment. I saw the triumphalism, the certainty that liberal democracy and market capitalism had won. Yet beneath that euphoria, a quiet assumption took root that the rest of the world would forever accept a system designed in Washington. That assumption now lies in ruins. The rise of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Egypt, Iran, and others is not merely an economic alliance. It is a declaration of sovereignty, a statement that no single power, however mighty, will dictate the terms of global finance, trade, or development when they create payment systems outside the dollar or development banks outside the IMF. They are not attacking America. They are escaping dependency. They are doing what every nation does when it recognizes an imbalance. It adjusts. The problem is that Washington still interprets every adjustment as a sign of defiance. We sanction, we lecture, we isolate, and in doing so, we accelerate the very changes we fear. I have watched diplomats dismiss warnings that sanctions breed alternatives. Now, those alternatives have names: SIPs in China, BRICS Pay, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The architecture of a post-American world is already being built brick by digital brick. This new order will not look like the 20th century. It will not have a single superpower enforcing rules. It will be a world of overlapping spheres, regional powers, shifting alliances, and pragmatic deals. It will be untidy and unpredictable, but it will be real. The age of empires is giving way to an age of balance, and balance, though humbling for those who once ruled, is far more sustainable for everyone else. What troubles me most is not the rise of others, it is our refusal to learn from it. Instead of adapting, we cling to nostalgia. Instead of investing in renewal, we double down on control. We view cooperation as weakness and compromise as surrender, but multipolarity is not a threat. It is an opportunity to redefine leadership, not as dominance, but as partnership. America could still lead in this world, but not by commanding it. We could lead through ideas, innovation, and example, through diplomacy that listens rather than dictates, through alliances built on respect, not dependence. But that requires humility, a word long absent from our foreign policy vocabulary. I often think of the British in 1945, victorious yet bankrupt. still speaking the language of empire, even as history had moved on. They mistook the trappings of power for its substance, and by the time they accepted reality, their influence had vanished. We are making the same mistake now, fighting to preserve a hierarchy that no longer exists. The multipolar world is not coming. It is here. Our choice is whether to enter it as a participant or as a relic. I know which outcome history rewards. The question is whether we do. Every empire in decline builds its own theater of reassurance. It's not made of armies or monuments. It's built from words, headlines, and narratives that tell the people everything is fine. In America, that theater is vast. It stretches from the halls of Congress to the studios of cable news, from think tank conferences to social media feeds. It is a machine designed to produce comfort when what we need most is clarity. I've spent years watching how this machine operates. Every crisis is explained away, every failure repackaged as progress. When the economy slows, we are told it's resilient. When debt explodes, it's manageable. When trust collapses, it's part of the cycle. The purpose isn't to inform, it's to tranquilize. Denial is a product now, sold daily to a public that no longer knows what the truth feels like. The media no longer investigates power, it performs for it. Outlets aligned with one political tribe echo its talking points. Those aligned with the other do the same. Each side presents fragments of truth, but never the whole picture, because the whole picture indicts everyone. Ratings depend on outrage, not understanding. I've appeared on those shows, given careful answers, cited data, offered warnings, and watched the producers cut everything that didn't fit the narrative. Complexity doesn't sell, fear and blame do. Politics has learned the same lesson. Voters reward those who promise ease, not honesty. So we are told we can have everything: lower taxes, higher spending, endless wars, and no sacrifice. To question this fantasy is to invite political suicide. I've seen candidates privately admit that the system is unsustainable, only to return to the campaign trail and speak of prosperity and strength. They aren't liars in the usual sense. They are prisoners of a system that punishes truth more harshly than failure. This is how empires delude themselves. The people are not ignorant. They are exhausted. They feel the decay, but are told to doubt their own eyes. Inflation temporary, debt under control, polarization overblown. Every warning becomes alarmism. Every critic a pessimist. Meanwhile, the pillars rot quietly behind the curtain of optimism. And when the collapse finally comes, it will be described as unforeseen. I sometimes think of the last years of the Soviet Union, when officials still spoke of progress as factories stood idle and shelves went bare. I was there. I remember the language measured, rehearsed, hollow. Every empire perfects this language before it falls. Confident tones masking fear. Statistics masking decline. We've mastered it now. The phrases are American but the melody is ancient. Technology has made the denial machine more efficient. Algorithms feed each citizen the version of reality most flattering to their beliefs. Truth has become a mirror maze, every reflection comforting, none revealing. We have mistaken information for knowledge, connection for understanding. The more we talk, the less we listen, the more we consume, the less we comprehend. The empire drowns not in silence, but in noise. This culture of denial doesn't just distort perception, it blocks reform. You cannot fix what you refuse to see. You cannot prepare for decline while insisting it cannot happen. The first step of recovery acknowledgement has become politically impossible. Any leader who dares to speak it is branded unpatriotic. Any citizen who repeats it is accused of cynicism. And so we drift further from reality, applauding the performance, even as the stage trembles beneath our feet. But history is immune to narrative. Reality always collects its debt. It doesn't care what the polls say or how many speeches are written to soothe us. The data, the debt, the decay, they remain, waiting for the moment when the illusion no longer holds. The tragedy is that it doesn't have to end this way. The same media that amplifies distraction could, in theory, awaken the nation. The same citizens lulled by comfort could demand truth if they chose to, but time is the one resource denial consumes fastest. The longer we pretend, the fewer options remain when pretending fails. I have seen enough history to know how this ends. If nothing changes, when the denial machine finally breaks, it does so all at once. Confidence evaporates. Leaders lose control of the narrative. And the people who once believed everything was stable realize it never was. The silence that follows is not peace, it's shock. That is where the United States now stands, at the edge of disbelief, still applauding the performance, unaware that the curtain is about to fall. There comes a moment in every empire's story when denial can no longer mask reality. The facade cracks, the numbers stop cooperating, and the truth begins to speak louder than the slogans. America is approaching that moment, not because of a single crisis, but because the sum of many ignored warnings has finally become impossible to ignore. The fiscal strain, the political paralysis, the social fragmentation, the loss of global credibility, they are no longer separate problems. They are one problem wearing different masks. I've watched these forces converge in country after country, and it always ends the same way. Confidence collapses first, then capability, then cohesion. By the time leaders admit the system is broken, it already is. Imagine what a reckoning would look like here. A fiscal shock that makes borrowing unsustainable, a geopolitical confrontation that exposes how overextended we've become, a social rupture triggered by economic pain. None of this is hypothetical. The conditions are visible in every chart, every poll, every budget. The timeline is the only mystery left. When creditors lose faith in a government's promises, they don't send warnings, they send interest rates. The cost of borrowing spikes, debt service consumes the budget, and choices narrow overnight. I've seen it happen in Latin America, in Southern Europe, in the Soviet bloc. It begins with talk of temporary pressures and ends with austerity. No one voted for America's difference is scale, not immunity. The military dimension of such a reckoning would be just as severe. Our global commitments depend on the illusion of infinite credit and endless resolve, but wars are financed with debt, alliances are maintained with credibility, and both are eroding. When the day comes that the United States must choose between paying interest and projecting power, the empire's reach will contract faster than anyone believes possible. History moves slowly until it doesn't. There is also the psychological break, the moment when the population realizes the system they trusted cannot deliver. Rome experienced it when legions stopped returning with gold. Britain faced it when rationing continued years after victory. The Soviet Union lived it when the shelves emptied and the slogans lost their magic. For the United States, it will come when Americans see that the prosperity they assumed was permanent was borrowed, not built. I fear that moment because it is unpredictable. People who have lived in stability for generations are rarely prepared for instability. They turn to extremes, anger, nationalism, scapegoating as they search for someone to blame. The divisions we already see in our politics would deepen into fractures. And once a society begins to fight itself, reform becomes impossible. Yet, reckoning need not mean collapse. It can also mean recognition, the decision to confront reality before it decides for us. I still believe in that possibility. I believe America retains the capacity for reinvention that saved it in past crises. But reinvention begins with humility. We must accept that the world has changed, that our debts are real, and that our strength must be rebuilt, not assumed. That requires choices. No leader wants to make cutting programs, reducing commitments, raising revenue, and redistributing resources from power projection to reconstruction. It requires telling the public what they do not want to hear, that prosperity without discipline is an illusion, and leadership without sacrifice is fraud. Every empire reaches this fork in the road. One path is denial until collapse. The other is courage through pain. The Ottomans delayed reform until they lost their empire. The British endured austerity and survived as a nation. The Soviets refused both and disintegrated entirely. America's fate will depend on which lesson we choose to learn. As I look ahead, I feel the same mixture of fear and hope that I have felt studying every other empire before us. Fear, because the signs are unmistakable. Hope, because awareness still exists, and awareness is the seed of change. If we can face this reckoning with honesty, it can become renewal. But if we meet it with more denial, then the next chapter of history will not be written by us, but about us the clock is still ticking. We are not out of time, but the hour grows late. I have spent my career warning about collapse, but warnings only matter if they point toward redemption. The fall of empires is not a law of nature, it is a consequence of choices. Decline is never inevitable until denial makes it so. Even now, even here, I believe America can recover, but not through the rituals that brought us here. Renewal requires something harder: honesty, restraint, and reconstruction from the inside out. The first step is to restore credibility, fiscal, political, and moral. We cannot continue to borrow from the future to pay for the present. The mathematics of power is simple. When interest payments exceed investment, decline is already underway. We must align spending with reality, not fantasy. That means ending the pretense that we can maintain a global military empire, fund European-style welfare programs, and keep taxes at historically low levels. The math does not work. It never has. A renewed America would focus on what sustains true strength: education, technology, and trust. These are the foundations that built our post-war dominance. Not weapons, not slogans, but knowledge. Yet our schools are failing. Our infrastructure is rotting. And our politics rewards ignorance over expertise. Power begins in the mind. If we cannot educate a generation capable of competing with the scientists, engineers, and innovators of Asia, then no amount of aircraft carriers will save us. Rebuilding education is not charity. It is a matter of survival. We must treat it as national defense because it is every dollar wasted on redundant weapons programs is a dollar stolen from the laboratories and classrooms that secure our future. The enemy is not another nation, it is our own neglect. The decline of American learning will destroy our strength faster than any foreign army ever could. But renewal is not just economic, it is moral. Our society must rediscover the purpose that made freedom more than a slogan. We cannot survive as a people if we treat one another as enemies. Democracy requires faith not in leaders, but in each other. Without that, the machinery of government grinds into cynicism. The social contract collapses not when citizens disobey, but when they stop believing obedience matters. Campaign finance reform, anti-corruption laws, term limits, and voting rights protection, these are not partisan issues. They are the structural scaffolding of self-government. Without them, democracy becomes a spectacle. Without trust, elections are noise. The founders designed this republic for argument, not paralysis. It is time to recover that courage, the courage to disagree constructively, to compromise without surrendering principle. Internationally, we must replace domination with diplomacy. Leadership in the 21st century will belong to those who can cooperate in a multipolar world, not those who cling to nostalgia for unipolar control. That means ending wars of choice, reducing bases abroad, and investing in alliances based on shared goals rather than fear. Power no longer means imposing outcomes. It means shaping them through persuasion and partnership. I do not underestimate the difficulty of this transformation. It will require sacrifice, and Americans have not been asked to sacrifice in a long time. Our culture has taught us to equate consumption with freedom, ease with success, comfort with virtue, but real freedom is not comfort. It is discipline. The only societies that survive in the long term are those willing to endure short-term pain for long-term stability. The truth is simple. We cannot remain the world's hegemon, but we can remain a great nation. We can be the world's conscience, its innovator, its example, if we are willing to accept limits and live within them. Greatness after an empire is not humiliation. It is maturity. Britain learned that lesson too late. We still have time. Renewal begins not with policy, but with humility. It begins when a nation acknowledges that it is not an exception to history, but a part of it. That realization is painful, but it is also liberating. It means we can stop pretending to control the world and start rebuilding our place in it. The American century may be ending, but the American idea of liberty, of ingenuity, of possibility can endure if we have the courage to save it. I know this because I have seen it before. Nations can change, systems can reform, people can wake up, but only when they realize that pride cannot feed them and denial cannot save them. Our empire may be dying, but our democracy does not have to die with it. The question now is not whether renewal is possible. The question is whether it is feasible. It is whether we still want it badly enough to begin. Every civilization reaches a point where it must decide whether it wishes to continue, not through war or conquest, but through will. That is where we stand now at the final crossroads of the American experiment. The numbers have spoken. The warnings have been issued, and the illusions have been exposed. What remains is choice. I've spent my career studying the ruins of once mighty nations. The common thread that unites them is not ignorance, but pride. They all knew what was happening. They all saw the signs, but they could not bring themselves to act, not because they didn't understand the cost of inaction, but because they refused to imagine life beyond the empire. To them, power was not a means to an end. It was the end itself. And that is how every empire dies, from the inside, in silence, surrounded by applause. I fear that silence now, it hangs over our debates, our media, our institutions, a quiet refusal to speak truths that would shatter the myth of permanence. We still act as if the world waits for our permission, as if history still bends toward our desires. But history bends only toward those who adapt. Those who refuse become its victims. The greatest danger to America is not decline itself, it is disbelief in the possibility of change. Decline can be reversed. Denial cannot. What stands in our way is not a foreign power, but the inertia of comfort, the paralysis of cynicism, a nation that has forgotten how to sacrifice cannot survive because endurance is the price of survival. We must begin again, not by trying to restore what was lost, but by reimagining what can still be built. The American idea has always been larger than the empire it created. It was born in rebellion against arrogance, in faith that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings or masters. That idea does not need global dominance to thrive. It needs integrity, compassion, and courage. It needs citizens who understand that leadership begins at home. Our global moment may be ending, but our moral moment need not. We can lead by example instead of force. We can trade arms for aid, coercion for cooperation, fear for fairness. We can rebuild a society that values knowledge more than wealth, service over spectacle, and truth over comfort. That is not weakness, it is strength rediscovered. But we must hurry. The window is closing, and history is impatient. The systems we built cannot bear infinite strain. The debts, the divisions, the distrust they are reaching critical mass. When they detonate, there will be no time for deliberation. The choices we postpone now will be made for us later. I am not naive. I know how powerful inertia is. I know how tempting it is to wait, to hope that someone else will fix what we have broken. But I also know that decline is not destiny. It is the consequence of forgetting who we are. If we truly remember that this nation was built not on fear but on faith, not on dominance but on democracy, not on comfort but on courage, then the end of empire can become the rebirth of the republic. The American century may fade, but the American spirit does not have to. We stand as generations before us did between pride and purpose, between illusion and truth. What happens next will not be decided in Washington or Wall Street, but in the conscience of every citizen who still believes that self-government demands self-awareness. History is watching us now, just as it watched those who came before. The question is no longer whether America can remain the dominant power. The question is whether we can remain ourselves. The answer will not be written in headlines or policy papers, but in the simple acts of courage we choose to take or to avoid. Empires fall, nations endure. Which one we become is up to us. And the time to choose is now.